Vernon Pike took one look at Eliza's twisted leg and walked away without saying a word. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry him, crossing deserts and mountains with nothing but hope and a worn suitcase. But the second he saw her limp, his face went cold. He climbed onto his wagon, left her standing in the dust, and drove off while the whole town watched. Abandoned, humiliated, broke. Most women would have crawled back east in shame. But Eliza Whitmore wasn't most women. And the dying cowboy she found 2 miles outside town was about to learn that the hardest thing about being saved is letting someone broken save you. Stay with me till the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this tale travels across the world. The Arizona heat hit Eliza Whitmore like a fist the moment she stepped off that train. She'd been warned about the desert. Everyone back in Philadelphia had stories about people who went west and got swallowed by the sun. But knowing something and feeling it are two different things entirely. The air burned going into her lungs. Sweat started running down her back before her feet even touched the platform. Through the train window, Copper Springs had looked small. Standing in it felt like being dropped into the bottom of an oven. Eliza gripped her suitcase tighter and scanned the crowd for Vernon Pike's face. She'd memorized it from the single photograph he'd sent. Strong jaw, serious eyes, dark hair under a wide-brimmed hat. The kind of face that looked like it meant what it said. The kind of man who wrote letters about fresh starts and endless skies and room to breathe. The kind of man who'd promised to be waiting when she arrived. The platform was chaos. Families reuniting with tears and laughter. Businessmen in dusty suits barking orders at porters. A group of rough-looking ranch hands passing a cigarette and eyeing the new arrivals like they were livestock at auction. But no Vernon. Not yet. Eliza smoothed her dress. Faded blue cotton that had started the journey crisp and was now wrinkled beyond salvation, and tried not to think about how she must look. 3 weeks on trains and coaches, sleeping in her clothes, washing her face in basin water that was never quite clean. Her blonde hair hung limp and damp against her neck, despite the pins trying to hold it up. Not exactly the picture of a blushing bride, but Vernon's letters had never mentioned wanting someone beautiful. He'd written about needing someone strong, someone willing to work hard and build a life from scratch, someone who wouldn't give up when things got difficult. Eliza could be that, had been that her whole life. "Miss, you need to move." She turned to find the conductor glaring at her like she was blocking something important. The platform had already cleared considerably. Most passengers claimed by waiting family or disappeared into town. "I'm waiting for someone," Eliza said. "My fiancé, Vernon Pike. He should be—" "Wait over there." The conductor jerked his chin toward a sliver of shade against the depot building. "Can't have you standing in the way." Heat rushed to Eliza's cheeks, but she nodded and limped toward the indicated spot. Her right leg, the one that hadn't healed right after the accident 17 years ago, always got stiff after sitting too long. The uneven boards of the platform made her gait worse, more obvious. She could feel eyes tracking her movement, could practically hear the thoughts behind those stares. Cripple. Damaged goods. What's a woman like that doing out here? Let them wonder. She was used to it. Eliza set her suitcase down and leaned against the depot wall. The shade helped, but not much. She pulled out her handkerchief and dabbed at her face, then immediately regretted it. The fabric came away brown with dust and sweat. Real ladylike, Eliza. Real impressive. Minutes crawled past. The train hissed and groaned, preparing for its journey back east. More passengers dispersed. A woman in a green dress met her husband with a kiss that made Eliza look away. An old man greeted what must have been his son, clapping him on the shoulder hard enough to raise dust from his jacket. Everyone had someone waiting. Everyone except her. Eliza's stomach started tying itself in knots. Where was Vernon? His last letter had been dated June 15th, 2 months ago, but she'd written back immediately with her travel plans. The exact date, the exact time. He should be here, unless something had happened. An accident, illness. What if he was hurt somewhere? What if he'd tried to come and couldn't? "You the mail order bride?" The voice came from behind, female, sharp as broken glass. Eliza spun around to find a tall woman with steel-gray hair pulled back tight enough to make her eyes squint. Her face had the look of someone who'd spent decades squinting into harsh sun and hadn't enjoyed a minute of it. Yes, I'm here to marry Vernon Pike." Relief flooded through Eliza's chest. Do you know him? Is he—" I'm his mother. The woman's mouth was a flat line. Constance Pike. Oh. Eliza's hand flew to her hair, trying to smooth it down. Oh, it's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Pike. I've been so looking forward to… Vernon? Is he with you? Is he all right? He's over there. Constance jerked her chin toward the street. Eliza followed the gesture, and her heart did something complicated in her chest. There he was, Vernon Pike, in actual flesh instead of faded photograph. Tall, just like she'd imagined. Broad shoulders, dark hair visible beneath his hat. He stood beside a sturdy wagon with 2 horses, watching the platform. Watching her. Why wasn't he coming over? I should go to him, Eliza said, reaching for her suitcase. I'm sure he's… Wait. Constance's voice could have frozen water in July. I need to ask you something first. In those letters you sent my son, did you mention your condition? The way she said condition made it sound like a disease, like something catching. Eliza's spine straightened on instinct, the same way it had straightened every time someone in Philadelphia had looked at her leg and decided they knew everything about her. I told Vernon about my leg in my very first letter, she said, keeping her voice steady. I wasn't going to lie about it. What exactly did you tell him? That I was in an accident when I was young, that it left me with a limp, that it doesn't stop me from working hard or keeping a home. Eliza met Constance's cold stare and didn't flinch. He wrote back and said it didn't matter to him. Did he? It wasn't a question. Constance looked Eliza up and down like she was a horse at auction that had just revealed a bad tooth. Well, we'll see about that. She turned and walked toward the wagon without waiting for a response. Something was wrong. Eliza could feel it in the way her stomach dropped, in the prickle of sweat that had nothing to do with the heat, but she picked up her suitcase and followed anyway. What else could she do? The walk from platform to street felt like walking to a gallows. Every step sent pain shooting up from her ankle. The suitcase seemed to gain weight with each yard. The sun pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight, and Vernon just stood there by that wagon, not moving, not smiling, not doing anything except watching her limp toward him with an expression she couldn't read. 20 feet away, she saw his eyes travel down her body, saw them catch on her uneven gait, saw something shift in his face, something that made her blood go cold despite the heat. Vernon? Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. It's me, Eliza. He didn't answer, didn't step forward, just kept staring at her leg like it was a snake that might bite him. Vernon, I told you in my letters, you said you had a limp. His voice was flat, empty of everything except disappointment. You didn't say it was this bad. The words hit her like a slap. I was honest about… Honest? Constance's laugh was sharp enough to cut. She wrote you pretty words and left out the ugly truth, Vernon. Look at her. You can't bring that home. What would people say? That, not her, that… Eliza's suitcase slipped from her fingers and hit the dirt. Vernon, please. I traveled all this way. You promised we'd… I didn't promise anything. He finally looked at her face instead of her leg, and there was nothing kind in his eyes, nothing like the man who'd written about building a life together. I said we'd see how things worked out when you got here. Well. He gestured at her like she was something spoiled. I've seen enough. You can't just… Her voice cracked. She hated that, hated the weakness of it. I don't have anywhere else to go. Should have thought of that before you lied in your letters. I didn't lie. Near enough. Vernon climbed up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. I'm not marrying a cripple, Eliza. I've got a reputation in this town, a business to run. I can't have folks looking at my wife and feeling sorry for me. The casual cruelty of it punched the air from her lungs. She stood there, frozen, stupid, unable to make words work, while Vernon clucked to the horses and the wagon lurched forward. Watched him drive away. Watched her future disappear down that dusty street. Watched every hope she'd carried 2,000 miles turn to ash. Constance lingered long enough to make sure the knife went all the way in. You're not the first girl to try this, you know. Coming out here with your sad story, thinking some desperate rancher will take pity on you. She looked Eliza up and down one last time, her lip curling. But my son's not desperate, and neither are any of the other men in this territory worth having. Go back east, girl. There's nothing for you here. Then she was gone too. following her son's wagon and leaving Eliza standing alone in the middle of Copper Springs with nothing but a battered suitcase and the ruins of every dream she'd ever dared to have. For a long moment, Eliza couldn't move, couldn't think, could barely breathe around the crushing weight in her chest. People were staring. She could feel their eyes like insects crawling on her skin. A woman outside the general store whispered something to her companion, and they both laughed. The depot agent shook his head and went back inside. A group of men outside the saloon watched her with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. The mail-order bride nobody wanted. The cripple who crossed a country for nothing. Eliza bent down and picked up her suitcase. Her hands were shaking, but she made them stop. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of these people who were already looking at her like she was pathetic. She started walking with no destination in mind. Just movement. Just putting one foot in front of the other because standing still meant drowning. Copper Springs wasn't much to look at. Maybe a dozen buildings clinging to existence in the middle of nowhere. General store. Saloon. Assay office. Church with a crooked steeple. Boarding house that looked only slightly less likely to collapse than the other structures. At the far end of the street, the buildings gave up entirely, and the desert took over. Endless red dirt and scrub brush climbing toward brown hills that shimmered in the heat. Room to breathe, Vernon had written. Room to start fresh. What a damn joke. Eliza made it to the church before her legs quit. She sank onto the steps, wood hot enough to burn through her dress, and set the suitcase beside her. Sweat ran into her eyes. Her leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and somewhere deep in her chest, something that had been holding her together for 3 weeks finally cracked. "You all right there, miss?" An older man in a preacher's collar stood a few feet away. He had kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime listening to other people's troubles. "I'm fine," Eliza lied automatically. "Hot day to be sitting in the sun." He climbed the steps and settled beside her, not too close, but near enough to talk. "Name's Reverend Samuel Morris. You're the young lady who came in on the afternoon train, aren't you? Here for Vernon Pike?" Of course he knew. In a town this size, everyone probably knew everything 5 minutes after it happened. "I was here for him," Eliza said quietly. But Mr. Pike changed his mind. The Reverend sighed, a sound full of genuine regret. "I'm sorry to hear that. Truly sorry. Vernon's a complicated man, and his mother—" He trailed off, apparently thinking better of finishing that sentence. "I don't need your pity." The words came out sharper than she meant them. "I just need to figure out what happens next. Do you have family back east? Someone who could wire you money for a ticket home?" "No." The word dropped like a stone into deep water. "No family, no money, no home to go back to." Silence stretched between them. The Reverend was probably searching for some useful advice that wouldn't sound condescending. Finally he said, "The boarding house might have work. Mrs. Chen, who runs it, is always looking for help. It wouldn't pay much, but you'd have a bed and meals while you sorted things out." The thought of staying in Copper Springs, seeing Vernon around town, facing Constance's smug satisfaction, enduring the whispers and stares, made Eliza want to crawl into a hole. But what choice did she have? "Thank you," she said, because the Reverend was trying to be kind. "I'll think about it." He stood and brushed dust from his trousers. "There's a Sunday social at the church this weekend. Community event. If you're still in town, you'd be welcome. Might be a good way to meet some folks who aren't quite so—" He searched for a diplomatic word. "Judgmental." Eliza managed a weak smile. "I doubt I'll still be here by Sunday." But watching Reverend Morris disappear into the church, she knew that was probably a lie. She had nowhere to go and no way to get there. Copper Springs had her trapped. The afternoon dragged on. Eliza eventually forced herself to stand and walk to the boarding house the Reverend had mentioned. Inside, she found a neat little lobby and a tiny Chinese woman who looked her up and down with sharp, assessing eyes. "You the Pike bride?" Mrs. Chen asked without preamble. "News really did travel fast." "I was supposed to be. Heard he left you standing at the station. Heard his mother called you that instead of using your name." Something in Mrs. Chen's voice softened slightly. "How much money you got?" $3.40. "That'll get you 3 nights in the smallest room. After that, you work for your keep or you leave. I need help with laundry and cooking. You any good at either?" "I can cook, and I work hard." "We'll see." Mrs. Chen held out a calloused hand. $3.40 up front. Eliza handed over almost every cent she owned and received a tarnished key in return. Room 4, upstairs, end of the hall. Privy's out back, meals at 7, noon, and 6. Don't be late. Mrs. Chen turned away, clearly done with the conversation. The room was barely bigger than a closet. Narrow bed, washstand, a hook on the wall serving as a closet. But it had a door that closed and a window that let in a breeze, and after 3 weeks of trains and shabby hotels, it felt almost luxurious. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself cry. She cried for Vernon's rejection, for Constance's cruelty, for the way those people on the street had looked at her like she was broken, for every hope and dream she'd carried in that worn suitcase. She cried until her eyes swelled and her throat ached, and the light through the window turned from brutal white to soft gold. Then she stopped, washed her face, made herself a promise. She would not give up, would not crawl back to Philadelphia in defeat, even if she could afford the ticket. She hadn't survived 24 years of being told she was worthless, just to prove everyone right by collapsing the first time life knocked her down. Vernon Pike didn't want her? Fine. She'd find another way. 3 days before her money ran out. 3 days to find work or make a plan or somehow carve out space for herself in this hostile town. Not much, but something. The next morning, Eliza woke before dawn to roosters and discovered that Mrs. Chen's idea of help with cooking meant preparing breakfast for 8 boarders starting at 5 in the morning. 3 hours standing over a hot stove frying eggs and bacon, her bad leg throbbing. But she didn't complain. Worked until every boarder was fed and every dish was washed, and Mrs. Chen gave her a curt nod that might have been approval. Lunch is at noon, Mrs. Chen said. Don't burn the biscuits this time. This time. As if Eliza had burned biscuits she hadn't been told to make until they were already smoking. The morning stretched empty after that. Eliza sat in her tiny room trying to figure out what to do with herself. No money for shopping, no friends to visit, nowhere to go where people wouldn't stare. Finally, she couldn't stand the 4 walls anymore. She left the boarding house and started walking, staying to back streets and alleys where she was less likely to run into Vernon or his mother or anyone who'd witnessed her humiliation. That's when she heard the conversation that changed everything. She'd been passing behind the general store, heading toward a small park she'd spotted from her window, when 2 men's voices drifted through the wall. Someone should check on Caleb Mercer, one said. Male, older, rough-edged. Saw him last week, and he looked half dead already. Infection in his arm was eating him alive. Not our problem. This voice was younger, harder. Man wants to die alone out on that busted ranch. That's his business. Still seems wrong. He's got no family left since his sister passed. No one to look after him. Then he should have thought of that before he drove everyone away with that temper. Mercer made his choices. Now he can live with them. Or die with them. The voices moved away, leaving Eliza standing frozen with her heart racing. A dying man. Alone on a ranch outside town. No family to care for him. It was none of her business. She had enough problems without taking on someone else's. The smart thing would be to forget what she'd heard and focus on survival. But Eliza had never been very good at doing the smart thing. She spent the next hour asking careful questions around town. The Mercer Ranch was about 2 miles west, past the old creek bed. Caleb Mercer was a rancher who'd lost his sister to fever 2 years back and hadn't been the same since. He'd let the place fall apart, driven away anyone who tried to help, and now he was dying from an infection he'd gotten working on fence repair 3 weeks ago. No one seemed particularly bothered. The general consensus was that Caleb Mercer was reaping what he'd sowed. But Eliza remembered what it felt like to have people look at you like you were already worthless, already written off. That afternoon, instead of returning to help with lunch, she made a decision that would have horrified her practical aunt and definitely shocked the Reverend. She was going to the Mercer Ranch. She was going to find Caleb Mercer. And somehow, she was going to save him. It wasn't a plan. Barely even an idea. But it was better than sitting in a tiny room waiting for her 3 days to run out. Eliza went back to her room, changed into her sturdiest dress, and packed supplies in her suitcase. Clean rags for bandages, the small bottle of laudanum she'd brought for her leg pain, a bar of soap, her grandmother's Bible that had medical notes in the margins. Then she walked out of Chen's boarding house without telling anyone where she was going, headed west toward the edge of town, and didn't look back. Eek. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Eliza limped along the rutted dirt road leading out of Copper Springs. Her leg already ached from the morning's work, and every step sent fresh jolts of pain shooting up from her ankle. The suitcase grew heavier with each minute. Sweat soaked through her dress and plastered her hair to her forehead. But she kept walking. 2 miles. That's what the man at the general store had said when she'd asked for directions, trying to sound like she had business out that way. In Philadelphia, 2 miles would have been easy. But this wasn't Philadelphia. This was Arizona desert in August, with the sun turning the air into something you could barely breathe and the ground radiating heat like a furnace. Eliza made it maybe half a mile before she had to stop. She set the suitcase down in a patch of thin shade from a scraggly mesquite tree and tried to catch her breath. Her chest felt tight. Her vision swam at the edges. When she touched her face, her fingers came away slick with sweat. This was stupid, dangerous, possibly suicidal. But going back meant admitting defeat. Meant spending 2 more days at the boarding house before her money ran out and Mrs. Chen threw her into the street. Meant facing the reality that she had nowhere to go and no one who cared whether she lived or died. At least if she died out here trying to help someone, it would mean something. Eliza picked up her suitcase and kept walking. The landscape was brutally beautiful. Red dirt stretched in every direction, broken by clusters of sage and juniper and the occasional twisted Joshua tree. In the distance, purple-brown mountains rose against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She understood why Vernon had written about the endless sky. It really did go on forever. The creek bed turned out to be exactly what it sounded like. A dry gully cutting through the desert floor, empty except for sun-bleached stones and skeletal tumbleweeds. Eliza scrambled down one side and up the other, nearly losing her footing twice in the loose gravel. On the far side, the road became less distinct, more like a suggestion of a path that someone had once traveled regularly but had since abandoned. Ruts overgrown with scrub grass. In places, the desert had reclaimed the route entirely, forcing Eliza to guess. She was starting to think she'd gotten lost when she spotted it, a weathered wooden sign hanging crooked from a post. Mercer Ranch, barely visible beneath dust and sun damage. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by apprehension. What was she planning to do here? She had no real medical training beyond folk remedies her grandmother had taught her. She didn't know Caleb Mercer. Didn't know if he'd even let her help. For all she knew, he'd take one look at her and send her packing just like Vernon had. But she'd come this far. Eliza followed the overgrown path past the sign and around a bend, and there it was, the Mercer Ranch, or what was left of it. The main house looked like it was slowly surrendering to gravity. The porch sagged in the middle. Several windows were broken, stuffed with rags or old newspapers. The roof had a visible hole in one corner. What might have once been a garden was now dead earth choked with weeds. Beyond the house, a barn with a collapsed wall. A chicken coop empty of chickens. Fence lines that had fallen into disrepair now wandered drunkenly across the property. The whole place felt abandoned, haunted, but there was smoke coming from the chimney, thin and weak, but smoke. Someone was alive in there. Eliza's heart hammered as she approached the house. She climbed the rickety porch steps carefully, testing each board. The last thing she needed was to fall through rotten wood and break her other leg. The front door hung slightly ajar. Eliza raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What was she supposed to say? "Hello, I'm a stranger who heard you were dying and decided to show up uninvited." Before she could figure out a better approach, a sound came from inside. A low groan, thick with pain. Eliza's grandmother-trained instincts kicked in. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim after the brutal brightness outside. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she almost wished they hadn't. The single room serving as kitchen, dining area, and living space was a disaster. Dirty dishes piled in the sink and scattered across a scarred wooden table. The floor thick with tracked-in dirt. The stove had ashes spilling onto the floor. Empty whiskey bottles littered every surface, and in a bed shoved against the far wall, half covered by stained blankets, was the man who could only be Caleb Mercer. He was unconscious, his face flushed with fever and slick with sweat, dark hair plastered to his forehead, 3 or 4 days of beard on his jaw. He looked like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. all sharp angles and prominent bones beneath sun-damaged skin. But it was his left arm that made Eliza's breath catch. The sleeve had been cut away, revealing an arm swollen to nearly twice its normal size from mid-forearm to shoulder. Red streaks radiated from a wound near his elbow, a deep gash that had been stitched at some point but was clearly infected. The flesh around the stitches was angry purple-red, and even from across the room, Eliza could smell the sickly sweet stench of rotting tissue. Blood poisoning. The red streaks told that story clearly enough. If it reached his heart, he'd be dead within days, maybe hours. "Mr. Mercer?" Eliza set down her suitcase and moved toward the bed. "Can you hear me?" No response. He was too deep in fever dreams. Eliza pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and felt heat radiating off him like he was burning from inside. His pulse, when she found it at his neck, was rapid and thready. His breathing came in shallow gasps. He was dying. The men in town had been right. But he wasn't dead yet. Eliza straightened and looked around the filthy room. She had no money, no medical supplies beyond the meager contents of her suitcase, no training, no idea what she was doing, but she had her grandmother's voice in her head, teaching her about fevers and infections and healing plants. She had 2 hands that knew how to work. She had stubbornness that had kept her alive through 24 years of people telling her she was broken, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose. "All right, Mr. Mercer," she said quietly to the unconscious man. "Let's see if we can keep you alive." She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. First things first, she needed water, clean water. Eliza found a bucket outside and a well that thankfully still worked, though the rope was frayed and the bucket was crusted with rust. She hauled up water until her arms ached, filled every pot and pan she could find in that disaster of a kitchen, and set them to boil on the stove. While the water heated, she cleared space, shoved dirty dishes to one side, swept the worst of the dirt off the floor near the bed, opened windows to let in air that didn't smell like sickness and whiskey and despair. Caleb moaned in his sleep, thrashing weakly. The movement made the infected arm shift and fresh blood seep through the makeshift bandage someone, probably Caleb himself, had wrapped around the wound. "Easy," Eliza murmured, though he couldn't hear her. "I know it hurts, but we're going to fix it." She hoped that wasn't a lie. When the water had boiled and cooled enough not to scald, Eliza soaked clean rags in it and began the careful, nauseating work of cleaning the infection. The stitches had to come out. They were holding in poison. She used her grandmother's sewing scissors, sterilized in boiling water, and tried not to think about how much this was going to hurt when he woke up. But Caleb didn't wake up, just groaned and tossed his head while Eliza pulled out black thread and cleaned away pus and dead tissue until her hands were shaking and her stomach was churning. The wound underneath was worse than she'd expected. Deep, ragged. The kind of gash you got from barbed wire or rusty metal, the kind that killed you if you weren't careful. Eliza packed it with clean cloth soaked in the strongest whiskey she could find among Caleb's bottles, wrapped it tight, prayed it would be enough. Then she turned her attention to the fever. Cool cloths on his forehead, on his neck, on his chest, changed every few minutes as they heated up from his burning skin. She trickled water between his cracked lips when she could, though most of it ran down his chin. Mixed a bitter tea from herbs she found growing wild near the well, feverfew and willow bark, if she was identifying them right, and got him to swallow a few sips. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The room grew darker. Eliza lit a lamp and kept working. She changed the bandage twice more when it soaked through, kept up the cool cloths, forced more water and bitter tea down his throat. Talked to him even though he couldn't hear her, because her grandmother always said that people could hear even in fever dreams, and the sound of a human voice could be an anchor keeping them from drifting too far away. "You're going to be all right," she told him, wiping his face with a cool cloth. "You hear me, Mr. Mercer? You're going to live through this. I didn't walk 2 miles through the desert to watch you die." His breathing stayed shallow. His pulse stayed too fast. But as night fell and stars began appearing through the broken roof, Eliza thought, maybe hoped, that the fever wasn't quite as high as it had been. Or maybe she was just exhausted and seeing what she wanted to see. Eliza finally sank into a chair beside the bed, every muscle in her body screaming. Her leg throbbed from standing all day. Her hands were raw from scrubbing. Her back ached from bending over the bed. She should sleep, should eat something, should do all the practical things that would keep her own body functioning. But she couldn't seem to move, could barely keep her eyes open. The last thing Eliza remembered before exhaustion dragged her under was Caleb's chest rising and falling in the lamplight, still breathing, still alive. For now, that would have to be enough. Eliza woke to the sound of someone choking. She jerked upright in the chair, neck screaming from the angle she'd slept at, and found Caleb Mercer trying to sit up in the bed. His eyes were open, barely, and wild with confusion. He was clawing at the blankets with his good arm, trying to get free, making sounds like he couldn't get enough air. "Stop! Stop! You'll tear the stitches!" Eliza lunged forward and pressed her hands against his shoulders, trying to ease him back down. "Mr. Mercer, you need to lie still. You're safe. Get off." His voice was a raw rasp, barely human. "Get the hell—" "I'm trying to help you." Eliza pushed harder, using her weight to pin him. He was weak as a kitten from the fever, but he was still a grown man, and she wasn't. "Please, just listen to me for 1 second. Caleb's eyes finally focused on her face. For a moment he just stared, breathing hard, like his brain was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A strange woman. In his house, touching him. "Who are you?" The words came out thick, slurred. His pupils were still dilated from fever. "What?" "My name is Eliza Whitmore. I found you yesterday afternoon. You've been unconscious for almost 20 hours. She kept her hands on his shoulders, ready to push him back down if he tried to get up again. "You had blood poisoning from that wound on your arm. You still have it, actually, but it's better than it was. I think. I hope." He blinked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "You... what?" "I cleaned the infection, changed your bandages, got your fever down. You're still sick, Mr. Mercer, but you're not dying anymore. Probably." Eliza pulled her hands back slowly, watching to make sure he wasn't going to bolt. "How do you feel?" "Like hell." He lifted his good hand to his face, rubbing at his eyes. "Like I got trampled by a horse and then lit on fire. That's the fever. It broke about an hour ago, I think, but you're still burning up." Eliza reached for the water basin beside the bed. The water was warm now, useless, and stood to go refill it. Her leg nearly buckled when she put weight on it. She'd been sitting too long in that chair. "Wait!" Caleb's voice stopped her. She turned back to find him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe. Suspicion. "Why are you here?" Good question. Eliza wasn't entirely sure she had a good answer. "I heard people in town talking about you," she said finally, "about how you were sick, dying, and no one was going to check on you. So you just showed up?" His eyebrows drew together. "You don't know me, don't know anything about me. I know you needed help. That's not a reason. It's the only reason I've got." Eliza picked up the basin and limped toward the door. "I'm going to get fresh water. Try not to die while I'm gone." She made it outside before her hands started shaking, made it all the way to the well before she had to set the basin down and lean against the sun-warmed wood, breathing hard. He was awake, talking. That meant the fever hadn't cooked his brain, meant she'd actually managed to pull him back from the edge. She'd saved him. The thought should have felt triumphant. Instead, it just felt terrifying. Because now what? She'd walked out here with no plan beyond don't let him die. She hadn't thought about what would happen after, where she would go, what she would do. Eliza hauled up fresh water from the well and carried it back inside. Caleb was still in bed, hadn't moved as far as she could tell, but his eyes were closed again. For a second she thought he'd passed out, but then he spoke without opening them. "There's bread in this box by the stove, probably stale, and some dried meat somewhere." His voice was rough. "If you're hungry." Eliza's stomach chose that moment to growl loud enough to hear across the room. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. Yesterday morning at the boarding house, maybe? "Thank you," she said quietly. She found the bread. It was stale, like he'd warned, hard enough to break a tooth if she wasn't careful, and a strip of jerky that was more leather than meat. But it was food, and she was starving, so she ate it standing by the window where morning light was starting to filter through the broken glass. The view outside was depressing. The garden was completely dead, nothing but dried stalks and bare earth. The fence closest to the house had fallen over entirely. One of the barn doors hung crooked on a single hinge. Everything looked like it was in the process of returning to dust. I know it's a mess. Eliza turned to find Caleb watching her from the bed. His eyes were clearer now, more focused, but there was something defeated in them. Something that made him look older than he probably was. How long has it been like this? She asked. 2 years, give or take. He shifted slightly, winced at the pain in his arm. Since my sister died. Haven't had much energy for upkeep since then. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate. About your sister, I mean. Caleb didn't respond, just closed his eyes again. Eliza finished her meager breakfast and went back to the bedside. She needed to check the wound, change the bandage again, see if the infection was actually improving or if she'd just been fooling herself in the dark last night. I need to look at your arm, she said. Do what you need to do. He didn't open his eyes, didn't look at her. Eliza unwrapped the bandage as carefully as she could, but Caleb still hissed in pain when the fabric pulled at the wound. The flesh underneath was still angry and swollen, but the red streaks had faded slightly. The smell wasn't quite as bad. It was improvement, small but real. It's getting better, she said, surprised by her own relief. Still infected, but not as bad as yesterday. You sound like you weren't sure that would happen. I wasn't. Eliza began cleaning the wound with fresh water and clean rags. I've never treated blood poisoning before. My grandmother taught me about infections, but she died when I was 16. I've been working from memory and guesswork. Caleb's eyes opened at that. He stared at her for a long moment. You're telling me you had no idea what you were doing? Not really, no. And you did it anyway. What else was I supposed to do? Let you die? Eliza kept working, not meeting his gaze. That seemed like the worst option. She could feel him watching her while she worked, studying her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he said, You're the mail-order bride. Eliza's hands stilled. How did you... Small town, everyone knows everything. His voice was dry. Vernon Pike's bride, who showed up with a limp and got left at the station. Word travels fast, even out here. Heat rushed to her cheeks. Then you know I'm not his bride. Not anymore, not ever, apparently. Yeah, I heard that part too. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Heard his mother called you that instead of your name. Heard the whole town watched him drive away and leave you standing in the dust. Is there a point to this conversation? Eliza's voice came out sharper than she intended. Because if you're just trying to remind me how humiliated I am, congratulations. Mission accomplished. The point is you could have gone back east, could have begged the Reverend for help, or worked at the boarding house until you saved enough for a train ticket. Instead, you walked 2 miles through the desert to help a dying stranger. He paused. Why? I already told you. No, you gave me an answer. I'm asking for the truth. Eliza met his eyes then. They were brown, she noticed. Dark brown with flecks of gold near the pupils. And they were looking at her like she was something more than just a cripple, or a rejected bride, or any of the other things people usually saw when they looked at her. I needed somewhere to go, she said quietly. And you needed help. It seemed like it might work out for both of us. That's still not the whole truth. Fine. You want the whole truth? Eliza tied off the fresh bandage with more force than necessary. I'm tired of people looking at me like I'm broken, like I'm something to pity or discard or feel sorry for. Vernon looked at my leg and decided I wasn't worth keeping. His mother looked at me and called me that, like I wasn't even human. The whole town looked at me like I was pathetic. She stood up, gathering the dirty bandages. But you were unconscious. You couldn't look at me at all. Couldn't judge me or pity me or decide I wasn't good enough. You just needed help, and I could give it. For once in my life, I got to be the one who wasn't broken, the one who could actually do something useful. The silence that followed felt heavy. Eliza turned away, busying herself with cleaning up the medical supplies, trying not to think about how much she'd just revealed to a complete stranger. You're right, Caleb said finally. His voice was quiet. I can't judge you. Don't have any right to, considering. He shifted in the bed, trying to sit up straighter and failing. But for what it's worth, I don't think you're broken. I think you're either very brave or very stupid, and I haven't figured out which yet. Despite everything, Eliza almost smiled. It's probably both. Probably. Over the next 3 days, they fell into an uneasy routine. Eliza would wake before dawn, sleeping in the chair beside Caleb's bed because there was nowhere else, and immediately check his wound and his fever. She'd change his bandages, force water and bitter tea down his throat, and try to get him to eat the meager food supplies she could find in the house. Caleb was a terrible patient. He complained about the tea, complained about lying in bed all day, complained about being helpless and useless and a burden. "If you don't like being a burden, try not dying," Eliza told him on the third morning, when he'd refused to drink the fever-few tea for the second time. "Because if you die, I walked all this way for nothing, and that's going to make me very angry." He drank the tea. When she wasn't tending to Caleb, Eliza started tackling the house. She couldn't stand the filth anymore. The dirt tracked everywhere, the dishes piled in the sink, the ashes spilling from the stove. She swept and scrubbed and washed until her hands were raw and her back ached. She found Caleb's sister's room on the second day. It was small, tucked behind a door she'd assumed was a closet. The bed was made. Clothes still hung on hooks. A hairbrush sat on a small table by the window, a few blonde hairs still caught in the bristles. It looked like someone had walked out 2 years ago and never come back. Eliza closed the door quietly and didn't mention it to Caleb. By the fourth day, Caleb's fever had broken for good. The infection was still there, still angry and swollen, but the red streaks were gone and he could sit up without looking like he was going to pass out. He watched Eliza work with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to do all this," he said, watching her scrub the floor near the stove. "The cleaning, I mean. You're not a servant." "I can't stand dirt," Eliza said, not looking up. "It makes me twitchy." "Still, you've done more than enough already." "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I'm living here too, and I refuse to live in a pigsty." She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "If that bothers you, you're welcome to get up and clean it yourself." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. It was a rusty sound, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "You're not very good at being grateful, are you?" "I could say the same about you." Fair point. On the fifth day, Caleb managed to stand for the first time. He made it about 3 steps before his legs gave out, and Eliza had to catch him before he hit the floor. He was heavier than he looked, all muscle and bone, and she nearly went down with him. "Easy," she said, struggling to keep them both upright. "Let's get you back to bed before you kill us both." "I'm fine," Caleb insisted, even as he leaned most of his weight on her. "Just need to get my strength back." "Your strength left with about 10 pounds of blood and infected tissue. It's going to take more than 5 days to get it back." Eliza half dragged, half carried him back to the bed. "Be patient." "I hate being patient." "I've noticed." But he did try to be patient after that, stopped complaining quite so much about the tea, started eating more without her having to force it, even managed a few polite words of thanks when she changed his bandages. It wasn't much, but it was something. On the 6th day, Eliza woke to find Caleb already awake, staring at the ceiling with an expression that made her stomach knot with worry. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting up in the chair. Her neck cracked audibly. "Is it the arm? Is the infection worse?" "No, the arm's fine." He didn't look at her. "I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous." "I've been thinking about what happens next," he continued, ignoring her attempt at humor. "You can't stay here forever. You need to get back to town. Figure out your own situation." Something cold settled in Eliza's chest. "You're telling me to leave?" "I'm saying you've got your own life to sort out. You can't spend it taking care of a sick rancher on a dying ranch in the middle of nowhere." "What if I want to?" Now he did look at her, really looked at her, with those brown eyes that saw too much. "Why would you want that?" "Because I don't have anywhere else to go." The words came out more honestly than she'd intended. "Mrs. Chen's boarding house wants money I don't have. I've got no family back east, no prospects, no future that looks any better than this one." "This isn't a future, Eliza. This is a place people come to give up and die." "Then maybe we're both in the right place." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm not your responsibility. And I'm not asking to be yours." Eliza stood, her leg protesting after hours in that chair. "I'm saying we could help each other. You need someone to help with the ranch while you recover. I need a place to stay that isn't full of people who think I'm pathetic. Seems like a fair trade to me. You don't know what you're offering. This place is falling apart. I've got no money to pay you. No way to make this ranch profitable again, even if I wanted to. You'd be hitching yourself to a sinking ship. Better than drowning alone. They stared at each other for a long moment. Outside, wind rattled the broken windows. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed. Finally, Caleb sighed. You're as stubborn as my sister was. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't meant as one, but there was something almost like amusement in his voice. Fine. You want to stay and help with the ranch? Stay, but don't expect me to be grateful or pleasant or any of the things a normal person would be. I think we're well past normal at this point. I think you're right. That afternoon, Eliza ventured out to explore the rest of the ranch properly. The barn was in worse shape than she'd thought. The collapsed wall had taken part of the roof with it, and what was left was barely standing. But there were tools inside. A workbench, coils of rope and rusty nails and things that might be useful if she could figure out what they were for. The chicken coop was completely empty. No chickens, no eggs, no sign that anything had lived there in months. But the structure was sound. Could be cleaned out and restocked if they could afford chickens. Which they couldn't. The garden was the most depressing part. Eliza stood in the middle of dead earth and dried stalks, trying to imagine what it must have looked like when someone cared for it. Rows of vegetables, maybe some flowers, a place that fed the people who lived here instead of just taking up space. She knelt down and dug her fingers into the soil. It was dry as bone on the surface, but deeper down there was moisture. The earth wasn't completely dead, just neglected. Eliza spent the rest of the afternoon pulling weeds and clearing away the worst of the debris. It was hard work, the kind that made her back ache and her hands blister, but it felt good to do something productive, something that might actually make a difference. When she came back inside as the sun was setting, she found Caleb sitting up in bed with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing something with his good hand. "What's that?" she asked, washing dirt from her hands in the basin. "List of things that need fixing." He didn't look up from the paper. "Thought if you're determined to stay, we should probably have a plan." Eliza dried her hands and walked over to look at the list. It was long, discouragingly long. Fix barn wall, repair fence lines, patch roof, replace broken windows, clear irrigation ditches, plant garden, on and on. "This is going to take months," she said. "Years, probably, if we can even do it at all." Caleb set down the pencil and looked at the list with something like despair. "I don't know why I'm bothering. This place is too far gone." "Maybe." Eliza took the pencil from his hand and added something to the bottom of the list. "But we've got to start somewhere." Caleb looked at what she'd written. "Get Caleb back on his feet? That's step one. Can't fix a ranch if the rancher's dead." Despite himself, Caleb almost smiled. Fair point. Over the next 2 weeks, Caleb's health improved steadily. The infection finally cleared completely, leaving behind angry scars but no more poison. He gained back some of the weight he'd lost, started walking around the house without looking like he might collapse. And Eliza kept working. She worked on the garden, turning over soil and clearing irrigation ditches that hadn't seen water in years. She patched the worst holes in the roof using materials she found in the barn and more hope than skill. She cleaned every surface in the house until it almost looked like a place people actually lived instead of a place they came to die. Caleb watched her work with an expression that changed from skeptical to confused to something else entirely. Something Eliza couldn't quite name. "You don't have to do all this," he said one afternoon, finding her on her hands and knees pulling weeds from the garden. "We've had this conversation already." "I know, but I mean it. This isn't your burden to carry." Eliza sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was standing without support now, his left arm still in a sling, but the rest of him looking almost healthy. The sun was behind him, turning his silhouette into something solid and real. "What if I want it to be?" she asked quietly. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For once, he seemed at a loss for words. Before he could figure out what to say, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. They both turned to see a rider coming up the path toward the house, a young man on a dusty horse, moving fast. Caleb's whole body went tense. "That's Tommy Chen from town, Mrs. Chen's nephew." Eliza's stomach dropped. Mrs. Chen. The boarding house. The 3 days she'd paid for that had run out almost 2 weeks ago. The young man pulled up his horse in front of the house and dismounted, removing his hat. "Mr. Mercer, ma'am." He nodded at both of them. "Sorry to bother you, but my aunt sent me. She's looking for Miss Whitmore here. Said she left the boarding house without settling her account." "I don't have an account," Eliza said, her throat tight. "I paid for 3 nights up front. That was all the money I had." "That was 2 weeks ago, ma'am. My aunt says you still owe for the work you were supposed to do. Says you left without notice and cost her help she was counting on." "That's ridiculous." "How much?" Caleb's voice cut through Eliza's protest. Tommy looked uncomfortable. "My aunt says $15 would settle it, for the lost work and the inconvenience." $15? It might as well have been $1,500. Eliza didn't have 15 cents to her name. "I'll pay it," Caleb said. Eliza's head snapped toward him. "What? No, you can't." "I'll pay it," he repeated, his voice firm. "But you tell your aunt that Miss Whitmore is working for me now. Has been for 2 weeks. So if she's got a problem with that arrangement, she can take it up with me directly." Tommy's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll tell her." He glanced at Eliza with something that might have been respect. "Ma'am." Then he was back on his horse and riding away before either of them could say anything else. Eliza waited until the hoofbeats faded before turning on Caleb. "You can't afford to pay $15 for me. You just said you don't have any money." "I've got enough for that." "But, Eliza," Caleb looked at her with an expression that was almost gentle, "you saved my life. You cleaned my house and fixed my roof and brought this place back from the dead. $15 is the least I owe you. The absolute least. You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything." The words were quiet but absolute. "And I'm not going to let some boarding house owner shake you down for money because you chose to help me instead of working in her kitchen. So let me do this, please." Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to protest that she didn't need charity or protection or anyone fighting her battles. But the look on Caleb's face stopped her. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even gratitude exactly. It was respect. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You're going to earn every cent of that $15 and then some." But there was something almost like warmth in his voice. "This ranch isn't going to fix itself." "No," Eliza agreed, looking around at the slowly recovering property. "I don't suppose it will." That evening, they ate dinner together for the first time. Eliza had found some beans and rice in the pantry and managed to turn them into something almost edible. They sat at the scarred wooden table, Eliza in one chair, Caleb in the other, and ate in comfortable silence. It wasn't much, but it felt like something. After dinner, Eliza stepped outside to watch the sunset. The sky had turned that particular shade of gold and crimson that only seemed to exist in Arizona, painting the desert in colors that looked almost unreal. She heard footsteps behind her and wasn't surprised when Caleb joined her on the porch. He moved slower than he used to, favoring his healing arm. But he moved. "I used to watch the sunset with my sister," he said quietly, staring out at the horizon. "She loved this time of day, said it made the whole desert look like it was on fire." "It does," Eliza agreed. "She died right here, on this porch. I was holding her hand." Caleb's voice was rough. "The fever took her so fast. One day she was fine. 3 days later she was gone. And I couldn't do anything to stop it." Eliza didn't say anything. Sometimes there weren't words. "I let this place fall apart after that," Caleb continued. "Didn't see the point in keeping it up when she wasn't here to see it. Drove away anyone who tried to help. Figured I'd just work myself to death and let the desert take the rest." "What changed?" "You did." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "You showed up and decided I was worth saving even though you had every reason not to. You worked yourself half to death fixing a place that wasn't yours, helping a man you didn't know, for no reason except that it needed doing." "I had reasons. I know your reasons. You told me. You needed somewhere to go and I needed help. But that's not the whole truth either." Caleb turned to face her fully. "The truth is you're the kind of person who sees something broken and can't help trying to fix it. Whether it's a dying rancher or a falling down ranch or a garden full of dead earth, you see possibility where other people see waste." Eliza's throat felt tight. "I don't know about that." "I do." He paused. "Eliza, I need you to understand something. I'm not Vernon Pike. I'm not going to make you pretty promises about the future or tell you everything's going to be perfect. This ranch is a wreck. I'm a wreck. We've got no money, no prospects, and a whole town that's probably talking about how the crazy hermit rancher has taken in the rejected mail-order bride. That's very romantic. Despite himself, Caleb huffed a laugh. What I'm trying to say is, if you want to stay here, really stay. Not just until you figure out something better. You can. You'd be an equal partner, not a servant or a charity case or any of that. An equal partner in trying to save this place. Eliza's heart was doing complicated things in her chest. Are you offering me a job or something else? I'm offering you a home. Caleb's voice was steady. Whatever else comes with that, we can figure out as we go. But right now, today, I'm offering you a place to belong, if you want it. Eliza looked out at the desert turning gold in the sunset, at the ranch that was still mostly broken, but maybe possibly starting to heal, at the man standing beside her who'd been as abandoned and written off as she had. She thought about Vernon Pike driving away in his wagon, about Constance calling her that instead of her name, about the town watching her humiliation and doing nothing. And then she thought about the garden starting to show tiny green shoots where she'd cleared the weeds, about the roof that no longer leaked quite as badly, about the house that felt almost warm now instead of cold and empty. I want it, she said quietly. I want to stay. Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding. Okay then. Okay. They stood there on the porch as the sun finally slipped below the horizon and the sky faded from gold to purple to deep blue. And for the first time since stepping off that train in Copper Springs, Eliza felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd found the fresh start she'd been searching for all along. Not the one she'd planned on, not the one she'd imagined, but the one she needed. The first month passed in a blur of backbreaking work that left Eliza so exhausted she barely had energy to think, which was probably a blessing. Thinking meant remembering. Remembering meant feeling the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she was gambling on a broken-down ranch, and a man who barely spoke unless he had to. But the work was good. Hard, but good. But by mid-September, they'd managed to get 2 of the fence lines repaired well enough to hold. The garden had started producing, not much, just some squash and beans and a few stubborn tomato plants that refused to give up despite the late season, but it was something. The barn wall was still collapsed, but Caleb had managed to shore up enough of the roof to make half of it usable again. They worked side by side most days, falling into a rhythm that didn't require much conversation. Caleb would point at something that needed fixing. Eliza would figure out how to fix it or ask questions until she understood. Then they'd work until the sun set and their bodies gave out. It wasn't the life Eliza had imagined when she'd boarded that train in Philadelphia, but it was a life. And that was more than she'd had standing in the dust outside the Copper Springs depot. The problem started when they ran out of supplies. We need to go into town, Caleb said one morning, staring into the nearly empty pantry with an expression like he'd rather eat his own boot. We're down to flour and some questionable jerky. Maybe half a bag of beans. Eliza's stomach clenched. She'd been dreading this moment for weeks. Can't we order supplies? Have someone bring them out? With what money? Caleb closed the pantry door. I paid Mrs. Chen. That cleaned me out. We need to sell something if we're going to eat, which means we need to go to town. You go. I'll stay here and work on... Eliza. Caleb turned to face her. You can't hide out here forever. I'm not hiding. Yes, you are, and I understand why. But we both know how this works. The longer you avoid town, the worse it gets. People talk. They make up stories. Better to face them now before the gossip gets out of hand. The gossip is already out of hand, Eliza said quietly. Tommy Chen didn't ride all the way out here just to collect $15. He came to see if the rumors were true. If the rejected mail-order bride was really living out here with the crazy hermit rancher. Caleb's jaw tightened. Let them talk. Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're calling. She stopped herself, shaking her head. Never mind. What are we selling? There's some old tack in the barn that's still in decent shape, and I've got my sister's jewelry. Not much, but it should get us enough for supplies to last another month or 2. The thought of Caleb selling his sister's jewelry to buy flour made Eliza's chest ache. Are you sure? Maybe there's another way. There isn't. His voice was final. We go tomorrow morning, early, before the town gets busy. We'll be in and out quick. But nothing was ever that simple. They left just after dawn, Caleb driving the wagon he'd managed to repair well enough to make the trip. Eliza sat beside him, her stomach in knots, watching the familiar landscape roll past. The dried creek bed, the scrub brush, the distant mountains that never seemed to get any closer. The closer they got to Copper Springs, the tighter Eliza's chest felt. She'd only been gone 5 weeks, but it felt like a lifetime. Like she'd become a different person in the space between leaving and returning. "You okay?" Caleb asked, not taking his eyes off the road. "Fine. You're a terrible liar." "I'm fine enough." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If anyone gives you trouble, you tell me. I don't care who it is. I can handle myself." "I know you can, but you don't have to." He glanced at her briefly. "Not anymore." Something warm uncurled in Eliza's chest, pushing back against the fear. "Okay. Okay." They reached Copper Springs just as the town was starting to wake up. A few early risers moved along the dusty street, the shopkeeper sweeping his porch, a woman hanging laundry, some ranch hands heading toward the saloon for breakfast. Eliza felt eyes turn toward them immediately, felt the weight of recognition and surprise and something uglier. She forced her spine straight and her chin up. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and climbed down, moving slower than he used to, but steady enough. He came around to Eliza's side and offered his hand to help her down. It was a small gesture, probably meant nothing, but the way his hand stayed at her elbow as they walked toward the store felt like a statement. The shopkeeper, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, looked up when they entered, and his eyes went wide with surprise that quickly shifted into something calculating. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice overly friendly in a way that set Eliza's teeth on edge. "Haven't seen you in months. Heard you'd been sick." "I was. I'm better now." Caleb's voice was flat, discouraging further conversation. "We need supplies. Flour, beans, coffee, salt, whatever you can give us for this." He set a small leather pouch on the counter. Henderson opened it and sorted through the contents, bits of old tack, a few pieces of worn jewelry that made Eliza's throat tight. He examined each item with exaggerated care, like he was doing them a favor by even considering it. "This isn't worth much," he said finally. "Maybe enough for half of what you're asking." "That's robbery and you know it," Caleb said. "That buckle alone is worth more than our whole list. Times are hard, Mr. Mercer. Can't give away inventory." Henderson's eyes flicked to Eliza, then back to Caleb. "Of course, if you're having trouble making ends meet, maybe you shouldn't be taking in strays, just saying." The word stray hit Eliza like a slap. She saw Caleb's whole body go rigid. "Watch your mouth, Henderson." "I'm just stating facts. Everyone in town's been talking about it. The mail-order bride Vernon Pike didn't want, living out at your place. People are wondering what kind of arrangement you've got going on out there." "The arrangement is none of your damn business," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And if you're not going to give us a fair price, we'll take our business elsewhere. There is nowhere else. I'm the only general store within 20 miles. Henderson leaned back, crossing his arms. "So you can take my offer or leave empty-handed. Your choice." Eliza could see Caleb's hands curling into fists, could see him calculating whether it was worth starting a fight in the middle of the general store over some flour and beans. "We'll take it," she said quietly, before Caleb could do something they'd both regret. "Whatever you're offering." Caleb turned to look at her, his expression a mix of frustration and something that might have been gratitude. Henderson smirked and started gathering their supplies, giving them barely half of what they'd asked for and clearly enjoying every second of it. They were loading the meager supplies into the wagon when Eliza heard a voice behind her that made her blood run cold. "Well, well, look who finally crawled out of hiding." She turned to find Constance Pike standing on the wooden sidewalk, looking at Eliza like she was something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of her shoe. Vernon stood beside his mother, his face carefully blank. "Mrs. Pike," Eliza said, keeping her voice steady. "Vernon." "Don't Mrs. Pike me like we're friends," Constance snapped. "Everyone in this town knows what you've been doing out at the Mercer place, living in sin with a man who isn't your husband. Shameful." "I'm working for Mr. Mercer," Eliza said, heat rising in her cheeks. "Helping with the ranch in exchange for room and board. There's nothing shameful about honest work." "Honest work," Constance's laugh was sharp. Is that what you're calling it? A young woman living alone with a bachelor rancher, no chaperone, no propriety. The whole town's talking about it. Then the whole town needs to find something more interesting to talk about. Caleb had come around the wagon to stand beside Eliza. His presence was solid, anchoring. Mrs. Pike, Vernon, if you'll excuse us, we've got work to get back to. I'm sure you do, Constance said, her voice dripping with insinuation. Must be all sorts of work that needs doing out there. Mother, Vernon started, looking uncomfortable, but Constance cut him off. Don't mother me. Someone needs to say what everyone's thinking. This girl came here pretending to be respectable, looking for a husband. My son was kind enough to meet her at the station, took one look at what she really was, and had the good sense to walk away. Now she's taken up with Caleb Mercer, of all people. A man who hasn't set foot in church in 2 years. A man who let his ranch fall to pieces and nearly drank himself to death. That's enough. Caleb's voice was low and dangerous. Is it? Because I think the good people of Copper Springs deserve to know what kind of woman is living among them. The kind who throws herself at any man desperate enough to take her in. First my Vernon, now you. Who's next, Mr. Mercer? Who's she going to latch onto when you finally come to your senses? Something inside Eliza snapped. She'd spent 5 weeks working herself to exhaustion, rebuilding a dying ranch, saving a man's life. And she was done, absolutely done, letting people like Constance Pike tell her who she was. You want to know what kind of woman I am, Mrs. Pike? Eliza stepped forward, ignoring the way her leg ached. I'm the kind who traveled 2,000 miles based on promises your son made and then broke the second I wasn't perfect enough for him. I'm the kind who got left standing in the dust while your precious Vernon drove away without saying a single word. I'm the kind who could have crawled back east in shame, but instead chose to make something of myself out here. By taking advantage of a sick man, I saved his life! Eliza's voice rang out across the street, drawing attention from passers-by. Mr. Mercer was dying of blood poisoning when I found him. The whole town knew it, and none of you did a thing. None of you checked on him. None of you cared whether he lived or died, but I cared. I walked 2 miles through the desert, cleaned his infected wounds, fought his fever for days, and pulled him back from death's door. Constance's face had gone red. That doesn't give you the right to... I wasn't finished. Eliza's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed strong. I didn't just save Mr. Mercer's life. I've spent every day since then helping rebuild his ranch, fixing his fences, planting his garden, patching his roof, working harder than I've ever worked in my life, not because I expect something from him, but because it needed doing and I could do it. She took a breath, looking Constance Pike straight in the eyes. So yes, I'm living at the Mercer Ranch. Yes, I'm working alongside Mr. Mercer. And if that makes me shameful in your eyes, then I'll wear that shame proudly. Because at least I'm doing something useful with my life instead of standing around town tearing down people who are trying to survive. The street had gone quiet. Eliza could see people watching from doorways and windows, could feel their eyes like weight on her skin. But she didn't look away from Constance. Vernon shifted uncomfortably. Miss Whitmore, I think... No. Eliza turned her gaze to him. You don't get to think anything about me. You lost that right when you drove away and left me with nothing, when you looked at my leg and decided I wasn't worth keeping. You made your choice, Vernon. I've made mine, and I'm not apologizing for it. For a moment, Vernon actually looked ashamed, but Constance recovered quickly, her face twisting with anger. How dare you speak to my son that way? After everything, I'm still standing here, Eliza said quietly. That's more than you gave me credit for. Caleb's hand touched her elbow gently. We should go. Eliza nodded, suddenly exhausted. They climbed onto the wagon, Caleb taking the reins. As they started to pull away, Constance's voice followed them. You'll regret this, both of you. This town won't forget. Good, Caleb called back without turning around. Make sure they don't. They rode in silence for the first mile. Eliza's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Now that the adrenaline was fading, she felt sick. She'd just publicly confronted Constance Pike and Vernon in the middle of town, had basically announced to everyone that she was living with Caleb Mercer with no plans to leave. The gossip was going to be vicious. I'm sorry, she said finally. I made everything worse. The whole town's going to be talking now. The whole town was already talking, Caleb interrupted. At least now they've got the real story instead of whatever Constance Pike was feeding them. But I shouldn't have. Yes, you should have. He glanced at her, and there was something almost like pride in his expression. You stood up for yourself. For both of us. That took guts. It was stupid. Maybe. But it was also the truth. Caleb turned his attention back to the road. And I'm tired of caring what this town thinks. They wrote me off 2 years ago. Wrote you off the second you stepped off that train. As far as I'm concerned, they can think whatever they want. Won't change what we're doing out at the ranch. Eliza wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe their opinion didn't matter. But she could still feel Constance's words like claws in her chest. Still see Vernon's carefully blank expression. Still hear the whispers that had followed them down the street. When they got back to the ranch, Eliza went straight to the garden and started pulling weeds with more force than necessary. Her hands were still shaking. Her chest felt too tight. She could feel tears threatening and refused to let them fall. She'd been stupid, reckless, had let her anger get the better of her common sense. Now the whole town thought she was exactly what Constance had called her, a desperate woman throwing herself at any man who'd take her in. Eliza. She didn't turn around, kept pulling weeds. I'm busy. I can see that. Caleb's boots appeared in her peripheral vision. But you're going to rip those plants right out of the ground if you keep going like that. They're weeds. That's a tomato plant. Eliza looked down and realized he was right. She'd been so focused on not crying that she hadn't been paying attention to what she was pulling. Damn it! Come on. Caleb held out his hand. Take a break. I don't need a break. I need to work. What you need is to stop punishing yourself for standing up to people who deserved it. Eliza sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. They're going to make our lives miserable. You know that, right? Constance Pike won't let this go. She'll turn the whole town against us. Let her try. Caleb lowered himself carefully to sit on the ground beside her, something he couldn't have done a month ago without help. Eliza, listen to me. I know what it's like to care what people think, to let their judgment eat away at you until you can't see straight. I did that for 2 years after my sister died. Let the whole town's pity and whispers drive me into the ground. He picked up a clod of dirt, crumbling it between his fingers. But you know what I learned? Their opinions don't put food on the table. Don't fix fences or patch roofs or bring dead gardens back to life. Only we can do that. Only we can decide whether this ranch lives or dies. It's not just about the ranch, Eliza said quietly. It's about your reputation, your standing in the community. I've ruined that. My reputation was already ruined. The town thought I was crazy and pathetic long before you showed up. Caleb turned to look at her. But you? You gave me a reason to stop being those things. Gave me a reason to fix this place instead of watching it crumble. So if the price of that is Constance Pike running her mouth, I'll pay it gladly. Eliza felt something crack in her chest, something that had been holding back tears since they left town. I just wanted to belong somewhere. That's all I wanted. And instead, I've made us both outcasts. We were already outcasts. Caleb's voice was gentle. That's why this works. 2 broken people trying to fix a broken ranch in the middle of nowhere. Maybe we don't belong in town, but we belong here, together. The tears came then, and Eliza couldn't stop them. She cried for the humiliation of Vernon's rejection, for Constance's cruelty, for the whispers and stares and the weight of being seen as shameful when all she'd done was try to survive. Caleb didn't try to comfort her or tell her everything would be fine. He just sat there in the dirt beside her while she cried, solid and steady and present in a way no one had been for her in longer than she could remember. When the tears finally stopped, Eliza wiped her face with her sleeve and let out a shaky breath. I ruined your tomato plant. We'll plant another one. And I made a scene in town. Good. They needed shaking up. Despite everything, Eliza almost smiled. You're taking this remarkably well. I've had practice dealing with town gossip. You learn to stop caring after a while. Caleb stood and offered her his hand. Come on, let's get these supplies put away and figure out what's for dinner. Eliza took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her leg protested. She'd been kneeling too long, but Caleb kept hold of her elbow until she was steady. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For not being ashamed of me. For standing beside me when Constance... Eliza, Caleb's voice was firm. I'm not ashamed of you. I'm not ashamed of anything we're doing here. and anyone who has a problem with it can go to hell. The certainty in his voice did something to her chest, made it easier to breathe, made the weight of the town's judgment feel a little less crushing. They spent the rest of the afternoon working in companionable silence, falling back into their rhythm. But something had shifted between them, something that felt both fragile and strong at the same time. That evening, after a simple dinner of beans and the last of the bread, Eliza stepped outside to watch the sunset. The sky was doing that thing again, turning gold and crimson and purple all at once, painting the desert in impossible colors. She heard the door open behind her and wasn't surprised when Caleb joined her on the porch. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, "about what happened in town today." Eliza's stomach knotted. "If you want me to leave, I understand. I made things complicated." "What?" "No." Caleb turned to face her. "That's not—" "Eliza, I don't want you to leave. I want the opposite." "What's the opposite?" "I want you to stay, permanently. Not just as someone who works here, but as—" He trailed off, looking frustrated with himself. "I'm not good at this. Words aren't my strong suit." "Try anyway." Caleb took a breath. "When my sister died, this place died with her. I let it happen because I didn't see the point in fighting anymore. Didn't see the point in anything. But then you showed up and—" He gestured helplessly. "You brought it back to life, brought me back to life. And I know we barely know each other. I know this whole situation is strange and probably improper and exactly what Constance Pike says it is. But I don't care." "Caleb, let me finish." His voice was rough. "I'm not offering you a fairy tale, Eliza. I'm not Vernon Pike with his pretty letters and false promises. I can't give you wealth or status or an easy life. But I can give you honesty, partnership, a place that's yours as much as it is mine, a future we build together, whatever that looks like." Eliza's heart was doing complicated things in her chest. "What exactly are you offering me?" "Marriage. Eventually. When you're ready. If you want it." Caleb's ears had gone red. "Or just a commitment. An understanding that you're not leaving and I'm not asking you to. That we're in this together, whatever this turns out to be. Even though the whole town thinks I'm shameful. Especially because of that." His voice was fierce. "Let them think what they want. You and I know the truth. That's what matters." Eliza looked out at the ranch, at the garden growing in soil she'd turned with her own hands, at the patched roof that no longer leaked, at the fences standing straight again. She thought about the life she'd imagined when she left Philadelphia, and how different this reality was from that dream. But this reality had something the dream never had. It had Caleb, who saw her strength instead of her weakness. It had work that mattered, and land that responded to her care. It had belonging, messy and imperfect and probably scandalous, but real. "I'm already committed," she said quietly. "I was committed the moment I decided to stay. The moment I chose this ranch over going back to town." She turned to face him. "So yes, Caleb, yes to all of it, to partnership and honesty and building something together, to staying permanently, to whatever future we can make out here." The relief that crossed Caleb's face was so profound it made her chest ache. "You're sure? Because once we do this, once we really commit to each other, there's no going back. The town's never going to accept—" "I don't care what the town accepts." Eliza reached out and took his hand, the first time she'd initiated touch between them. "I care about this. About us. About making this ranch something we can be proud of." Caleb squeezed her hand gently. "Then I guess we better get back to work." "I guess we better." They stood there on the porch as the sun disappeared completely and stars began appearing in the darkening sky. And Eliza realized that for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the naive hope she'd carried across the country in Vernon's letters, but something steadier, something built on hard work and honest words and the knowledge that she'd already survived the worst this town could throw at her. The weeks that followed were harder than anything Eliza had experienced yet. Word of the confrontation with Constance Pike spread through Copper Springs like wildfire, and the town's judgment came down on them with crushing force. When they went back for supplies 2 weeks later, Henderson refused to serve them at all. Said his store had standards and he wouldn't support immoral arrangements. They had to ride an extra 15 miles to the next town just to buy flour and coffee. The few people who had been friendly to Caleb before Neighbors who'd occasionally checked on him, ranch hands who'd helped with cattle drives in better years, stopped coming around entirely. The Reverend made a point of mentioning the importance of propriety in his Sunday sermon, and everyone knew who he was talking about. Letters started arriving, unsigned, of course, telling Eliza she was a disgrace, a harlot, a woman bringing shame to decent folk, telling Caleb he was a fool being taken advantage of by a conniving cripple who'd latched onto him out of desperation. Eliza burned the letters without reading them all the way through, but she couldn't burn away the words that had already burrowed under her skin. One morning in early October, she woke to find Caleb standing by the window, staring out at nothing. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sitting up in the chair she still used as a bed. "Thinking." He didn't turn around. "About?" "Whether I'm being selfish, keeping you here when it's making your life harder." Eliza stood and crossed to stand beside him. "You're not keeping me anywhere. I'm choosing to be here. The town hates you because of me." "The town hated me before they even knew you existed." She touched his arm gently. "Vernon Pike made sure of that when he left me at the station. This isn't your fault, Caleb." "Maybe not, but I could make it easier on you. I don't know. I could take you back to town, help you find respectable work somewhere, give you a chance at a normal life." "I don't want a normal life." Eliza turned him to face her. "I want this life. Here, with you, building something that matters. Is it hard? Yes. Is the town making it harder than it needs to be? Absolutely. But I'd rather face that with you than be respectable and miserable somewhere else." Caleb studied her face for a long moment. "You really mean that?" "I really mean it. Even though everything," Eliza said firmly. "Now stop trying to get rid of me and come help me figure out how to fix that irrigation ditch before the winter rains wash it away completely." Despite himself, Caleb smiled. "Yes, ma'am." They worked on the irrigation ditch all morning, digging and hauling rocks and arguing about the best way to redirect water flow. It was exhausting, dirty work that left them both covered in mud and sweat. But it was theirs. Their work on their land, building their future. And no amount of town gossip could take that away from them. Late October brought cooler temperatures and a letter that changed everything. Eliza found it stuck in the fence post at the end of their property line. An official-looking envelope with the church seal on it. She carried it back to the house, turning it over in her hands with a sense of foreboding. Caleb was repairing a saddle at the kitchen table when she came in. He looked up, saw the envelope, and his expression darkened. "What's that?" "Invitation to the Sunday social." Eliza opened it and scanned the contents. "Reverend Morris is hosting a community gathering. Says it's important that everyone attend. Says the church wants to address recent concerns about moral standards in our community. They're going to make an example of us." "Looks like it." Eliza set the letter down. "We don't have to go." "Yes, we do." Caleb put down the saddle. "If we don't show up, it proves everything they're saying about us. That we're ashamed, that we know what we're doing is wrong. And if we do show up, they'll tear us apart in front of the whole town. Probably," he met her eyes, "but at least we'll be there to defend ourselves." Eliza's stomach churned at the thought. "I don't know if I can face them again. Last time was bad enough. And that was just Constance and Vernon. This will be the whole town." Caleb stood and crossed to where she was standing. "Then we face them together. You said you wanted this life, Eliza. This is part of it. The ugly part where we have to prove we're not ashamed of what we're building here. I'm not ashamed." "Then show them that." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "We go to the social. We hold our heads high. We let them say whatever they're going to say, and then we come home and keep living our lives exactly the way we have been." Eliza looked at the invitation again. The social was this Sunday, 3 days away. 3 days to prepare for what would probably be the most humiliating experience of her life. "All right," she said finally. "We'll go." "We'll go." But as Sunday approached, Eliza's anxiety only grew worse. She had exactly one decent dress, the same faded blue one she'd worn off the train. It was clean now, mended where it had torn during her work on the ranch, but it still looked tired and shabby next to what the town women would be wearing. "You look fine," Caleb said Sunday morning, watching her fuss with her hair in the cracked mirror. "I look like exactly what they think I am, poor, desperate, out of place." You look like someone who's been working hard to rebuild a ranch. There's no shame in that. Easy for him to say. He just had to put on a clean shirt and run a comb through his hair. Men always had it easier that way. They left for town with the sun still low in the sky. Caleb drove the wagon in silence, his jaw set in that way that meant he was steeling himself for a fight. Eliza sat beside him, trying to keep her hands from shaking. The church hall was already packed when they arrived. It seemed like everyone in Copper Springs and half the surrounding ranches had turned out for this. People milled around tables laden with food, talking in clusters that went quiet when Caleb and Eliza walked through the door. The silence spread like ripples in water. Within seconds, every eye in the room was on them. Eliza forced herself to keep walking, keep breathing, keep her chin up even though she wanted to turn around and run. Reverend Morris approached them with a strained smile. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming." "Reverend," Caleb said neutrally. "Wouldn't miss it." "Yes? Well," the Reverend looked uncomfortable. "There's food and drink over there if you'd like. The program will start shortly." Translation: the public shaming would begin soon. They made their way to the refreshment table, and Eliza was painfully aware of people moving out of their path, creating distance. Like whatever moral failing they supposedly had might be contagious. Mrs. Chen was there with her nephew, Tommy. She gave Eliza a brief nod. Not friendly, but not hostile either. It was more acknowledgement than anyone else had offered. "Miss Whitmore," Tommy said quietly. "Mr. Mercer. Good to see you both looking well." "Thank you, Tommy," Eliza managed. At least someone was being civil. But across the room, Constance Pike was holding court with a group of well-dressed women, her voice carrying clearly. "I still say it's shameful that they'd show their faces here, as if decent people want to associate with that kind of behavior." One of the other women murmured something Eliza couldn't hear. Constance's response was loud enough for half the room. "Oh, I'm sure she tells herself it's all proper and innocent. But we know better, don't we? A young woman living alone with a man, no family, no supervision. There's only one thing that could be." Eliza felt heat rush to her face, felt every eye in the room waiting to see how she'd react. Caleb's hand found hers under the cover of the refreshment table, squeezed gently, a reminder that she wasn't alone. She squeezed back. Reverend Morris climbed onto the small stage at the front of the hall and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming today. As you know, we've gathered not just for fellowship, but to address some concerns that have arisen in our community. Concerns about moral standards, about propriety, about the example we set for our young people." Here it comes, Eliza thought, the public condemnation. "There have been rumors," the Reverend continued, "gossip about members of our community engaging in behavior that some find questionable, and I felt it was important that we address these issues openly rather than letting whispers and speculation continue unchecked." Constance Pike stood up, not waiting to be called on. "Reverend, if I may, I think we all know who you're talking about, and I think it's important that we speak plainly. Miss Whitmore came to this town under false pretenses. She deceived my son about her condition, and when he rightfully declined to marry her, she immediately took up residence with Mr. Mercer. An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man with no regard for decency or reputation." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eliza's grip on Caleb's hand tightened. "Furthermore," Constance continued, warming to her subject, "she has made no effort to find proper employment or living arrangements. She hasn't attended church or made any attempt to integrate into our community in a respectable way. Instead, she's chosen to isolate herself with Mr. Mercer, doing who knows what out on that ranch. We're rebuilding the ranch," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Working from sunup to sundown, fixing fences and planting crops and repairing buildings, that's what we're doing. Nothing more, nothing less." "So you say," Constance shot back, "but you have no witnesses to that, no chaperone to vouch for the propriety of the arrangement. For all we know, For all you know, you should mind your own business," Caleb interrupted. "What Eliza and I do on my property is nobody's concern but ours." The room erupted in shocked whispers. "You didn't interrupt Constance Pike. You certainly didn't tell her to mind her business." Vernon Pike stood up beside his mother. He'd been quiet until now, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Mr. Mercer, I think what my mother is trying to say is that the appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging as actual impropriety. Perhaps if you and Miss Whitmore were to marry, it would put these concerns to rest. We'll marry when and if we choose to, Caleb said, not because this town demands it. Then you admit the relationship is romantic in nature? Another woman called out. I admit that it's none of your business what the nature of our relationship is. The crowd was getting agitated now, voices rising, people calling out questions and accusations. Eliza could feel the hostility building like a physical pressure in the room. Constance's voice cut through the noise. The truth is, this woman is exactly what she appears to be. A desperate cripple who latched onto the first man foolish enough to take pity on her. She's using you, Mr. Mercer, using your isolation and your grief to secure a place for herself, and you're too blind to see it. Something inside Eliza broke. Not in a bad way, more like a wall she'd been hiding behind finally crumbling. She stood up, pulling her hand free from Caleb's, and stepped forward. You want to call me desperate, Mrs. Pike? Fine, I was desperate. I came to this town with nothing but a suitcase and some letters from a man who promised me a future and then took it back the second I wasn't perfect enough for him. Her voice didn't shake. You want to call me a cripple? Go ahead. I've got a twisted leg from an accident when I was 7. It makes me limp, makes me slower than other people, makes me exactly the kind of woman your son decided wasn't worth keeping. The room had gone silent, everyone staring, but Eliza kept going. But you know what else I am? I'm the woman who heard that Caleb Mercer was dying alone on his ranch, and instead of walking away like everyone else in this town, I walked 2 miles through the desert in August heat to help him. I'm the woman who cleaned infected wounds and fought fever and saved a man's life while all of you wrote him off as hopeless. She turned, addressing the whole room now. How many of you knew Caleb was sick? How many of you knew he was dying of blood poisoning and did nothing? Show of hands? Several people looked down at their feet. A few hands went up reluctantly. That's what I thought, Eliza said. You all knew, and you all decided it wasn't your problem, that he'd driven you away with his grief and his temper, so he deserved whatever he got. Now wait just a minute, someone started to protest. I'm not finished. Eliza's voice was sharp. After I saved his life, I spent the next 2 months working harder than I've ever worked. I repaired the house, fixed the roof, planted a garden in dead soil, and brought it back to life. I mended fences, cleared irrigation ditches, and started bringing that ranch back from the edge of ruin, all while living on almost no money and even less food. She looked at Constance. So yes, Mrs. Pike, I'm living at the Mercer Ranch. Yes, I'm working alongside Caleb without a chaperone or whatever propriety you think I should have. And you know what? I'm proud of it. I'm proud of every fence I've fixed and every plant I've grown and every day I've chosen to build something instead of giving up. That doesn't excuse, Constance began. Excuse what? Eliza challenged. Excuse me for surviving, for finding a way to make a life when everyone in this town had already decided I was worthless, for choosing honest work and partnership over sitting around waiting for someone's approval. She turned back to the crowd. You want to judge me? Fine, judge me. But ask yourselves this. What have any of you done to help either of us? What have you offered besides gossip and condemnation? When Caleb was dying, did any of you ride out to check on him? When I was stranded with no money and nowhere to go, did any of you offer real help instead of pity? The silence was profound, uncomfortable. Vernon Pike stood up again, his face red. This isn't about us. This is about you refusing to behave in a way that's appropriate for an unmarried woman. Appropriate. Eliza laughed, and it came out bitter. You want to talk to me about appropriate, Vernon? You stood me up at the train station after I traveled 2,000 miles based on promises you made. You looked at my leg and decided I was damaged goods. You left me there with no money, no home to go back to, and no apology. And now you want to lecture me about appropriate behavior? Vernon's mouth opened and closed. He had no answer for that. The truth is, Eliza said, her voice quieter now but no less firm, I came to this town looking for a place to belong. I thought that would mean a husband and a traditional life and all the things young women are supposed to want. But what I found was something better. I found work that matters, land that responds to care, and a partner who sees my strength instead of my weakness. She looked at Caleb, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Caleb Mercer didn't take advantage of me. He didn't take pity on me. He offered me equality and honesty and a chance to build something real. And if that makes me shameful in your eyes, then I'll wear that shame like a badge of honor. Caleb stood up then, moving to stand beside her. She's right about all of it. This town wrote both of us off. Her because she wasn't perfect enough for Vernon Pike. Me because I let grief turn me into someone you didn't recognize anymore. And you know what? You were probably right to write us off. We were both broken, both lost. He reached for Eliza's hand, and this time he held it openly, in front of everyone. But broken doesn't mean worthless. Lost doesn't mean hopeless. Eliza taught me that. She showed up when I was dying and refused to let me give up. She worked herself to exhaustion fixing a ranch that everyone, including me, thought was beyond saving. She gave me a reason to get up in the morning instead of just waiting to die. His voice got rougher. So yeah, she lives at my ranch. Yeah, we work together without a chaperone. And yeah, someday soon I'm going to ask her to marry me properly, not because this town demands it, but because I can't imagine my life without her in it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eliza's heart stuttered in her chest. They talked about marriage eventually, but this was the first time Caleb had said it out loud, publicly, in front of everyone. But that's our choice to make, Caleb continued, our timeline, our life, and if you can't respect that, then we don't need to be part of this community. We'll build our own life out there on that ranch, and you can keep your gossip and your judgment and your Sunday socials. He looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. But I'll tell you something, the woman standing beside me is worth 10 of anyone in this room. She crossed a desert to help a dying stranger. She brought dead earth back to life. She stood up to all of you when it would have been easier to run away. And I'll be damned if I let any of you make her feel small for that. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Then surprisingly, Mrs. Chen stood up. The boy is right. Everyone turned to stare at her. Mrs. Chen never spoke up at these gatherings. Never got involved in town politics or gossip. I run a boarding house, she continued in her matter-of-fact way. I see a lot of people come through Copper Springs. Most of them are running from something or looking for something easy. But Miss Whitmore? She looked at Eliza. She worked harder in 3 mornings than most of my boarders work in a month. And when she left, it wasn't because she was lazy or improper. It was because she found someone who needed help more than I did. Mrs. Chen turned to face Constance Pike. You talk about moral standards, Mrs. Pike, but what's more moral? A woman following arbitrary rules about chaperones and propriety? Or a woman saving a man's life and helping him rebuild something worthwhile? That's not the point, Constance began. That's exactly the point, Mrs. Chen interrupted. You're so worried about appearances that you've forgotten what actually matters. Miss Whitmore has done more good in 2 months than most of us do in a year. And you want to shame her for it because she didn't do it the way you think she should. Another voice spoke up from the back. Mrs. Chen's right. Eliza turned to see one of the older ranchers standing, a man named Jack Sullivan, who she'd seen around town but never spoken to. I've known Caleb Mercer since he was a boy. Knew his sister, too, before she passed. And I saw what her death did to him. Saw him give up on everything and everyone, including himself. Sullivan looked at Eliza. But I rode past his ranch last week, and you know what I saw? Fences standing straight, a garden growing, smoke from the chimney. That place looked alive again for the first time in 2 years. And if Miss Whitmore did that, then she's got my respect, propriety be damned. More murmurs, but different now. Less hostile, more thoughtful. Reverend Morris cleared his throat. Perhaps we've been too quick to judge. Perhaps nothing, Constance Pike snapped. This is exactly what I warned you about, Reverend. Let one instance of impropriety slide, and soon everyone thinks the rules don't apply to them. We have standards in this community for a reason. And what reason is that, Mrs. Pike? The question came from a young woman Eliza didn't recognize. So you can decide who's worthy and who isn't? So you can make people feel small for not living the way you think they should? How dare you? I'm serious, the young woman continued. My husband and I started courting before we were formally introduced. Does that make us improper? The Johnsons got married after knowing each other only 3 weeks. Is that scandalous? Where exactly is the line, Mrs. Pike? And who made you the one who gets to draw it? Constance's face was turning purple. This is different. This is a woman living in sin with a man she's not married to. The Bible is very clear. The Bible is also clear about judging others, Reverend Morris said quietly. About casting stones when you're not without sin yourself. About showing mercy and compassion instead of condemnation. He looked at Eliza and Caleb. I'll admit, when I first heard about your living arrangement, I had concerns. But hearing you speak today, Seeing the work you've done, the lives you've rebuilt, I think perhaps we've been focusing on the wrong things. Perhaps the question isn't whether Miss Whitmore is following every social convention to the letter. Perhaps the question is whether she's living a life of purpose and integrity. And from where I'm standing, the answer seems clear. Vernon Pike, who'd been sitting down again, stood up one more time. His face was pale. Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology for how I treated you at the station, for driving away instead of being the man I should have been. Eliza stared at him. Of all the things she'd expected today, Vernon apologizing wasn't one of them. I was a coward, Vernon continued. I let my mother's voice in my head convince me that what other people thought mattered more than keeping my word, and you paid the price for that. I'm sorry, truly sorry. Thank you, Eliza said quietly, because she didn't know what else to say. Constance Pike looked like she might explode. Vernon Zachary Pike, you sit down this instant. You don't owe that woman anything. Yes, I do, Mother. Vernon's voice was firm in a way Eliza had never heard from him. And it's long past time I said so. He turned to the room. I think we all owe Miss Whitmore an apology. We watched her get humiliated and did nothing. We gossiped about her instead of helping her. And when she found a way to survive on her own terms, we condemned her for it. That says more about us than it does about her. The mood in the room had shifted completely. People were talking among themselves now, some looking ashamed, some looking thoughtful. Constance Pike stood alone in her outrage, and for the first time, no one seemed to be listening to her. Caleb squeezed Eliza's hand. I think that's our cue to leave. But before they could move toward the door, Reverend Morris spoke again. Mr. Mercer? Miss Whitmore? I wonder if you might stay for just a few more minutes. I'd like to make an announcement. Eliza and Caleb exchanged glances. What kind of announcement? Caleb asked warily. The Reverend smiled. The kind that might help put some of these concerns to rest permanently. Eliza's heart was still racing from the confrontation, but she nodded. They'd come this far. Might as well see it through. Reverend Morris addressed the room again. I've been thinking about what Mrs. Chen and Mr. Sullivan said. About how we've been so focused on propriety that we've lost sight of what really matters. And I think they're right. This community should be about supporting each other, helping each other, building each other up, not tearing people down for not fitting into neat little boxes. He paused. So here's my proposal. Mr. Mercer, Miss Whitmore, if you're willing, I'd like to offer the church's support for your ranch. We have members who could help with repairs. We have resources we could share. And we have a community that I hope is ready to do better than we've been doing. Caleb's jaw tightened. We don't need charity. It's not charity. It's neighbors helping neighbors, the way it should have been from the start. Reverend Morris looked around the room. How many here would be willing to spend a Saturday helping with repairs at the Mercer Ranch? Show of hands. Slowly, hesitantly, hands started going up. Not everyone. Constance Pike sat with her arms crossed, glaring, but enough. More than Eliza would have expected. And, the Reverend continued, if you two are planning to marry, as Mr. Mercer indicated, the church would be honored to host the ceremony, free of charge, as our way of apologizing for how we've treated you both. Eliza felt tears prickling at her eyes. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected anything close to this. Caleb looked down at her. What do you think? I think, Eliza's voice was thick, I think maybe this town isn't completely hopeless after all. The Reverend smiled. Is that a yes to the help? And to the wedding? Eliza looked at Caleb, really looked at him. At the man who'd offered her partnership when everyone else saw her as broken. Who'd stood beside her when the whole town turned against them. Who'd just declared his intention to marry her in front of everyone, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. The help, yes, she said. The wedding. She turned to Caleb. You said someday soon you'd ask me properly. I think I'd like that to happen first before we start planning ceremonies. Despite everything, despite the tension still crackling in the room, Caleb laughed. Fair enough. The Reverend nodded, looking pleased. Then it's settled. We'll organize a workday for the ranch, and when you two are ready for that next step, we'll be ready too. As people started moving around the room again, some coming up to offer apologies, some still looking uncomfortable, Constance Pike storming out with Vernon trailing behind her, Eliza felt something shift in her chest. They hadn't won everyone over. probably never would, but they'd stood their ground, told their truth, and instead of being destroyed by it, they'd somehow survived. More than survived. "You were magnificent," Caleb said quietly, leading her toward a quieter corner of the hall. "The way you spoke to them. I've never seen anything like it." "I was terrified," Eliza admitted. "Still am, a little." "Couldn't tell." He paused. "I meant what I said up there, about asking you to marry me properly." "I know. And I will, soon, when the moment's right." Caleb's ears had gone red. "Just wanted you to know that wasn't just talk. I meant it." Eliza reached up and touched his face gently. "I know you did. And when you ask, my answer is going to be yes." "Yeah? Yeah." They stayed at the social for another hour, enduring well-meaning questions and awkward apologies. It was exhausting and overwhelming and occasionally still painful, but it was also something else. It was a beginning. As they drove home in the afternoon light, the wagon rattling over familiar ruts in the road, Eliza felt lighter than she had in months. The town hadn't given them a fairy tale ending, hadn't erased all the hurt or fixed all the problems, but they'd given them something almost as valuable, a chance. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked. Eliza looked out at the desert, at the mountains in the distance, at the sky starting to turn gold. "I'm thinking that when I got off that train 2 months ago, I thought my life was over, thought I'd made a terrible mistake coming here. And now? Now I think maybe it was the best mistake I ever made." Caleb smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger, happier. "Best mistake I ever made, too." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they finally reached the ranch, their ranch, as the sun was setting, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt home. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of crimson and gold, and for the first time in months, the silence between them felt completely peaceful. No tension, no worry about what came next, just two people who'd fought their way through hell and somehow found each other on the other side. "I keep expecting to wake up and find out today was a dream," Eliza said, leaning back against the porch post. The way people turned around, Vernon apologizing, the Reverend offering to help. "It wasn't everyone," Caleb reminded her. "Constance Pike looked ready to burn the church down." "True, but it was enough." Eliza turned to look at him. "More than I expected, honestly." Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring out at the horizon. "My sister used to say that people are like this desert, harsh and unforgiving on the surface, but there's life underneath if you dig deep enough. Water in the dry creek beds, seeds waiting for rain. I never really believed her until today." She sounds like she was wise. She was stubborn, mostly. Wouldn't let me give up on anything, even when giving up made more sense. He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You remind me of her sometimes. The way you just decided this ranch was worth saving and refused to hear otherwise. Is that a good thing?" "It's the best thing." Caleb stood and held out his hand. "Come on. I want to show you something." Eliza took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her leg protested. It had been a long day of standing and tension, but she followed him down the porch steps and around the side of the house. He led her to a spot on the small rise behind the property where you could see the whole ranch spread out below. The repaired fences, the garden showing the last of the fall harvest, the house with its patched roof and fixed windows, the barn that was still half collapsed but no longer looked completely hopeless. "This is where I used to come after my sister died," Caleb said. "I'd stand here and look at everything falling apart and think about just walking away, letting the desert take it all back." "What stopped you?" "Stubbornness, mostly. The same kind my sister had, the same kind you have." He turned to face her, and the setting sun caught his eyes, turning them amber. "I told you I'd ask you properly when the moment was right. I think this is the moment." Eliza's heart started hammering. "Caleb, let me say this before I lose my nerve." He took both her hands in his. "I don't have a ring. Don't have much of anything to offer you except this land and this life and a future that's probably going to be harder than either of us wants it to be. But I can promise you honesty, partnership, a man who sees you for who you really are and thinks you're the strongest person he's ever met." His voice got rougher. "Eliza Whitmore, will you marry me? Not because the town expects it or because it's proper or because we need to prove anything to anyone, just because I can't imagine building this life with anyone else. Eliza felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but she was smiling. You're wrong about one thing. Caleb's face fell slightly. What? You have a lot to offer me. You've given me a home when I had nowhere to go. Work that matters. A partner who respects me. That's everything, Caleb. That's more than I ever thought I'd have. She squeezed his hands. So yes, I'll marry you. Not because it's proper or expected, but because you're right. I can't imagine building this life with anyone else either. The relief that flooded Caleb's face was so profound it almost broke her heart. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and they stood there on that rise above the ranch, while the sun finished setting and the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky. I love you, Caleb said quietly against her hair. Should have said that first, probably, but I love you, Eliza. You brought me back to life. I love you too. The words felt natural, easy, like something she'd been waiting to say for months. Even when you're grumpy and stubborn and refuse to drink your medicine. He laughed, and the sound vibrated through his chest into hers. Especially then, I hope. Especially then. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and that night Eliza finally moved out of the chair beside Caleb's bed and into the small room that had belonged to his sister. It felt like a line they were crossing, from whatever undefined thing they'd been to whatever they were becoming. The next morning they woke to the sound of wagons on the road. Eliza looked out the window to see a small caravan heading toward the ranch, 4 wagons loaded with supplies and people. Reverend Morris was driving the first one. Mrs. Chen and Tommy were in the second. The rest were ranchers and townspeople Eliza recognized from the social. They actually came, she said, surprised despite everything that had happened yesterday. Caleb joined her at the window, looking equally stunned. I'll be damned, they actually came. They went out to meet the group, and Reverend Morris climbed down from his wagon with a smile. Good morning. Hope you don't mind us showing up unannounced, but we figured the sooner we got started, the better. Started on what? Caleb asked. Fixing this place up properly. The Reverend gestured to the wagons. We've got lumber, nails, tools, paint, and about 15 people ready to work. Thought we'd start with that barn wall and see how far we get. Over the next week, the Mercer Ranch transformed in ways Eliza hadn't thought possible. The townspeople came every day, bringing supplies and labor and a cautious friendliness that slowly warmed into something more genuine. The barn wall was repaired. The worst sections of fence were replaced entirely. Someone donated 3 chickens and a rooster for the empty coop. Mrs. Chen brought food every day, more food than Eliza and Caleb could eat in a week. Can't work on empty stomachs, she said gruffly, but there was kindness in her eyes. Tommy Chen worked alongside Caleb mending fence posts and never once mentioned the gossip or the confrontation at the church. He just worked, cracking jokes and making Caleb laugh in a way Eliza had never heard before. Even Vernon Pike showed up on the 3rd day, looking uncomfortable but determined. Thought you could use an extra pair of hands, he said to Caleb. If you'll have me. Caleb studied him for a long moment. You know anything about roofing? Some. Then grab a hammer and get up there. That corner's been leaking since before you left Eliza at the station. Vernon flinched at the reminder but nodded. Yes, sir. Eliza watched them work together, 2 men who had every reason to hate each other, finding common ground in honest labor. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was something close to peace. By the end of the week, the ranch looked more alive than it had in years. The barn stood straight. The fences were solid. The garden had been expanded and prepared for spring planting. Someone had even fixed the crooked sign at the end of the property line so it hung straight and proud. On the last day of the work party, as people were packing up their tools and preparing to head back to town, Reverend Morris pulled Eliza aside. Have you 2 set a date yet? He asked. For the wedding? Eliza glanced at Caleb, who was helping load lumber scraps onto a wagon. We were thinking December, before the winter really sets in. December's perfect. First Saturday? The Reverend pulled out a small notebook. I'll put you down. And Eliza, I'm glad you're staying. This community is better with you in it, whether everyone knows it yet or not. Thank you, Eliza said, her throat tight. For everything. For defending us. For organizing all this. I should be thanking you. You reminded us what we're supposed to be. Neighbors helping neighbors, not judges tearing each other down. He smiled. That's a lesson we all needed. After the wagons had departed and the dust had settled, Eliza and Caleb stood in the middle of their newly transformed ranch, just looking at everything that had been accomplished. "I can't believe they did all this," Eliza said. "A week ago they were ready to run us out of town." "People are complicated," Caleb said. "They're capable of cruelty and kindness, sometimes in the same breath. The trick is giving them a chance to choose which one they want to be." "Is that your sister's wisdom again?" "No, that's mine." He put his arm around her shoulders. "Hard-earned from 2 years of being angry at everyone and everything. Turns out anger's exhausting. Forgiveness is easier. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive everyone yet." "You don't have to be. But maybe we can start with accepting help when it's offered, building bridges instead of walls." He paused. "That's what you taught me, after all." The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and work. The ranch still needed constant attention, animals to feed, repairs to maintain, winter preparations to make. But there was lightness to the work now, a sense of building towards something instead of just fighting to survive. Eliza's dress was simple, made from fabric Mrs. Chen had given her at a price she could actually afford. Nothing fancy, but it was new and clean and fit her properly. She altered it herself, sitting by lamplight in the evenings while Caleb worked on repairing tack. "You don't have to make it perfect," he told her one night, watching her unpick a seam for the third time. "I want it to be right," Eliza said. "This is important." "You could wear a flour sack and still be the most beautiful woman in the territory." She looked up at him, eyebrows raised. "That's very romantic for someone who's usually terrible with words." "I'm trying." His ears went red. "Is it working?" "A little." She smiled. "Keep trying." The night before the wedding, Eliza couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars and thinking about how far she'd come. From that train platform where Vernon had abandoned her to this porch where she'd chosen to stay. From broken and desperate to strong and certain. The door opened behind her and Caleb stepped out. "Couldn't sleep either?" "Too much thinking." "About what?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. "About my aunt back in Philadelphia. About what she'd say if she could see me now." "What do you think she'd say?" "Probably that I'm being foolish, that I should have found a proper husband with money and status instead of a struggling rancher in the middle of nowhere." Eliza pulled the blanket tighter. She never understood why I wanted more than just survival. "And now?" "Now I have more. I have this ranch, this life. You." She looked at him. "And I don't care what she'd think about it." Caleb sat down beside her. "My sister would have liked you. She always said the best things in life are the ones you have to fight for, the ones that don't come easy. This definitely didn't come easy. No, but it came real, and that's better." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, until the first hints of dawn started painting the eastern sky. Then Caleb stood and held out his hand. "Come on, we should get some sleep before the big day. Can't have the bride falling asleep during her own wedding." "That would be scandalous," Eliza agreed, taking his hand. "More scandalous than everything else we've already done?" "Probably not." The wedding was small and simple, held in the church on the first Saturday in December. The whole town turned out, some out of genuine goodwill, some out of curiosity, and a few, Eliza suspected, just to see if they'd actually go through with it. Constance Pike was notably absent, but Vernon came, sitting in the back row with an expression that was hard to read. Regret, maybe. Or just the uncomfortable awareness of roads not taken. Eliza wore her simple dress and carried wildflowers that somehow still bloomed in December in this strange desert climate. Caleb wore his best shirt and looked more nervous than she'd ever seen him. His hands shook slightly when he took hers at the altar. "You okay?" she whispered. "Terrified," he whispered back. "You?" "Same." Reverend Morris smiled at them both. "That's how you know it matters." The ceremony was brief. No flowery speeches or elaborate promises, just simple vows about honesty and partnership and building a life together. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb kissed her, gentle and slightly awkward in front of all these people, Eliza felt something settle into place in her chest. This was right. However strange the path had been to get here, this was exactly where she was supposed to be. The reception was held in the church hall, the same place where she'd been publicly judged just 2 months before. But this time there was laughter instead of whispers, dancing instead of condemnation. Mrs. Chen had made a cake that was slightly lopsided but tasted like heaven. "To the bride and groom," Tommy Chen called out, raising his glass. "May your ranch prosper and your fences stand strong. And may you never run out of coffee," someone else added to general laughter. Caleb pulled Eliza onto the makeshift dance floor, and they swayed together to music from a fiddle player who wasn't quite on key. Eliza's leg ached from standing so long, but she didn't care. She was dancing at her own wedding in a town that had written her off, with a man who saw her strength instead of her weakness. "What are you smiling about?" Caleb asked. "Everything. Nothing, just this." She looked up at him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me, the real me. Not the limp or the desperation or any of the broken pieces. Just me." Caleb's expression softened. "That works both ways, you know. You saw me when I was at my worst, dying and angry and half gone, and you decided I was worth saving anyway. You were worth saving. So were you." They danced until the music stopped and people started drifting home. Vernon approached them before leaving, his hat in his hands. "Congratulations," he said awkwardly. "I hope you'll both be very happy." "Thank you," Eliza said, and she meant it. She didn't love Vernon, probably never had, despite what his letters had promised. But she didn't hate him either. He was just a man who'd made a mistake and was trying, in his own way, to make amends. "Miss Witt, Mrs. Mercer," Vernon corrected himself. "I really am sorry, for all of it. You deserved better than how I treated you." "I got better," Eliza said simply. "So I think it worked out the way it needed to." Vernon nodded and left, and Eliza never saw him look quite so small. As the sun started setting, Caleb hitched up the wagon and they headed home to the ranch. Their ranch now, officially, legally, in every way that mattered. "Mrs. Mercer," Caleb said, trying out the name, "how does it feel?" "Strange. Good strange." Eliza leaned against his shoulder. "How does it feel to you?" "Like the first good decision I've made in 2 years." They rode in silence for a while, the familiar landscape rolling past in the fading light. When they reached the top of the rise where Caleb had proposed, he pulled the wagon to a stop. "What are we doing?" Eliza asked, looking. He gestured to the ranch spread out below them, fences standing straight, garden beds prepared for spring, house solid and warm with smoke rising from the chimney they'd repaired together. "I want to remember this exact moment, when everything finally felt right." Eliza looked out at the land they'd fought so hard to save, at the life they'd built from absolutely nothing, and she thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train 3 months ago, broken, desperate, certain her life was over. That woman wouldn't recognize who Eliza had become, wouldn't understand the strength she'd found in honest work and partnership, wouldn't believe that being abandoned by Vernon Pike was the best thing that could have happened. "You know what I think?" Eliza said. "I think sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually the doors we need to walk through. Vernon leaving me at that station felt like the end of everything, but it was really just the beginning." "The beginning of what?" "Of me. The real me. Not the version I thought I had to be to make someone else happy. Not the version my aunt wanted or Philadelphia expected. Just me." She took Caleb's hand. Strong and stubborn and capable of saving dying ranchers and dead gardens. Caleb smiled. "And marrying difficult men who barely know how to say thank you. Especially that." They sat there as the sun completed its descent and the first stars appeared. The desert wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and dry earth and the promise of winter rain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out and was answered by another. "I'm not going to lie to you," Caleb said. "This life isn't going to get easier. We'll have bad years and good years. Times when the ranch thrives and times when we're barely scraping by. Times when the town accepts us and times when they remember why they thought we were scandalous." "I know, but I promise you this. I'll work beside you every single day. I'll respect your strength and never ask you to be less than you are. And I'll love you, the real you, limp and stubbornness and all, until the day I die." Eliza felt tears prickling at her eyes again. "That's the most words I've ever heard you string together at once." "I've been practicing." "It was good. You should do it more often." "Don't push your luck." They laughed together, and the sound echoed across the desert, swallowed by the vast Arizona sky that went on forever in every direction. As full darkness settled, they drove down to the ranch house, their house, and Caleb helped Eliza down from the wagon. She stood for a moment in front of the porch, looking at the door she'd first walked through when Caleb was dying, and she was desperate, and neither of them had any idea what they were building. "You coming?" Caleb asked from the doorway. "In a minute. I just want to—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain it, but Caleb seemed to understand anyway. He came back down the steps and stood beside her, both of them looking at the house that had become a home. "It's strange," Eliza said quietly. "I came to Arizona looking for a place to belong, a husband who'd accept me, a normal life, and I didn't get any of those things, not the way I expected. Are you disappointed?" "No, I'm grateful." She turned to face him. "Because what I got instead was better. I got partnership instead of acceptance, love instead of tolerance, a life that's mine instead of one I'm just fitting into." She looked back at the house. "I got to be the person who saves instead of the person who needs saving. I got to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I'm not broken, that my limp doesn't define me, that I'm strong enough to build something from nothing and refuse to give up even when everyone tells me I should." "You are strong enough," Caleb said. "Strongest person I know." "We're strong enough," Eliza corrected. "Together, that's the whole point." They walked into the house hand in hand, leaving the desert night outside. And for the first time since either of them could remember, the future didn't look like something to survive. It looked like something to build. In the months and years that followed, the Mercer Ranch slowly became known throughout the territory. Not for scandal or gossip, but for the quality of their crops and the strength of their livestock. Eliza's garden produced vegetables that won prizes at county fairs. Caleb's cattle became some of the healthiest in the region. People stopped talking about the mail-order bride who'd been abandoned and started talking about Eliza Mercer, the woman who could coax life from dead soil and fix anything that needed fixing. They stopped seeing Caleb as the crazy hermit rancher and started seeing him as a man who'd built something worth having. Not everyone changed their minds. Constance Pike went to her grave convinced they were living in sin, wedding certificate be damned. A few families never quite accepted them, but enough people did. Enough people saw past the scandal to the substance underneath. And Eliza learned something important in those years. She learned that belonging isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you build for yourself, one fence post at a time, one season at a time, one stubborn refusal to give up at a time. She learned that strength comes in unexpected forms. Sometimes it's the courage to step off a train into the unknown. Sometimes it's the determination to save a dying stranger. Sometimes it's just the daily choice to keep working when everything seems impossible. Most importantly, she learned that being broken, having a twisted leg or a wounded heart or a past full of rejection, doesn't mean you're worthless. It just means you're human. And humans, for all their flaws and failures, are capable of extraordinary things when they stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real. Years later, when young women came to Copper Springs looking for fresh starts and second chances, they'd inevitably hear about Eliza Mercer, about how she'd arrived with nothing and built everything, how she'd been rejected and ridiculed and somehow turned it into triumph. And Eliza would tell them the truth, that it wasn't easy, that it hurt like hell sometimes, that there were days when she wanted to give up and days when giving up seemed like the only sensible option. But she'd also tell them that every scar they carried, every rejection they'd survived, every time someone had looked at them and seen only weakness, all of it was proof they were strong enough to survive anything, strong enough to build something beautiful from the broken pieces. That was the real story of the abandoned bride in Copper Springs. Not a fairy tale about a prince who swept in to save her, but a truth about a woman who saved herself and in doing so, saved a man who'd given up hope. A truth about two broken people finding each other in the middle of nowhere and deciding that broken didn't mean worthless. It meant ready to build something new. And beneath the endless Arizona sky, on a ranch that refused to die, Eliza and Caleb Mercer built a life that proved everyone who doubted them wrong. Not by being perfect, not by following every rule or meeting every expectation, but by being honest, by working hard, by choosing each other every single day, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult, because that's what love is in the end. Not the pretty promises and letters or the easy moments when everything's going right. It's the choice to stand beside someone when the whole world's watching and judging. It's the decision to see strength where others see weakness. It's the daily work of building something together that neither person could build alone. And that, Eliza thought, watching the sun set over their ranch 30 years later with Caleb's hand still steady in hers, was worth more than all the fairy tales in the world.